Thank you so much, Julie. And as always, it's really a bracha, it's a zechut, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. Shabbat Shalom. I really love teaching Parashat HaShavua in particular, so it's always really a joy to get to be with all of you. And the way that we're going to do this is, as those of you who've learned with me before in this setting know, I really like to encounter the text directly. And before we do that, though, I'm going to give a summary of the parasha, which, as I think we can say safely with every single parasha in Bereshit, this parasha is action-packed, it is complicated, it is challenging. There are a lot of things. And I want to make a disclaimer that we are not going to be looking at the story of Dinah today, which is in Genesis 34, excuse me. However, I really encourage folks to look at contemporary commentaries on Dinah. I really encourage folks to encounter that text and encounter a lot of the more modern commentaries on it. It is a very troubling episode in our parasha, and it is not going to be the focus of our learning today, but I want folks to know that there are really amazing teachers out there doing great work on Dinah, and that should be part of your Shabbat learning rotation. So today we are going to be we're going to be looking at Esav and Yaakov and their reconciliation, or perhaps we can call it their meeting. I want to challenge us to think critically about whether or not this is in fact a reconciliation. What actually happens here? We're going to go through the text together. We're going to pause as we do so. So if folks are interested in reading, get ready to do that. I'll call on you shortly, but I want to do a quick summary first, which is that we have, of course, Yaakov going back to Eretz Canaan, Eretz Yisrael, the land of his fathers. And we open this parasha by recognizing that Esav is going to be coming to meet him. And there's the first, we're not going to look at this directly, but there is the very famous scene of the dream. Yaakov has yet another dream in this week's parasha, where his sciatic, some people call it the sciatic nerve, or the muscle on the hip or the thigh. I think we could maybe even think about it as the hip flexor, knowing what we do today about the skeleton and about human muscles. But Yaakov wrestles with an angel until the break of dawn. And eventually the angel tears his thigh muscle. And this is why Bnei Yisrael do not eat that. Those of you who may be meat eaters or who are aware of kashrut know that in kashrut you do not eat the sciatic nerve because of this dream. Yaakov then, for the rest of his life, has a limp of some kind, we understand. But this is a very dramatic dream because Yaakov is getting ready to meet his brother. And we're going to now open with him having woken up the next morning after this very eventful experience. And we're going to be starting on Genesis 33, verse 1. We are using the Koran translation found on Sefaria. Julie, I will invite you now to screen share. And anyone who would like to start reading should feel invited to do so. And I'm going to interrupt you at different points, so don't be alarmed. But we're going to get through a little bit of this text, and we'll see with time how far we get. But I would love to begin the reading.
Great. And while we're transitioning here, can you just restate the title of the book that you mentioned?
The book that I mentioned.
You mentioned a book. Maybe someone asked for the title of the book, and I had missed it because I was getting the link. So, but
okay, you know what? We're using the Koran translation on Sefaria.
Yes. I think someone got confused about the book versus your talk. The title of the Eli talk was entitled "We Were All at Sinai: The Transformative Power of Inclusive Torah," and that's Rabbi Lauren Tuchman's talk. And
I believe it's actually on the My Jewish Learning website. So if you look on the My Jewish Learning website, you should be able to find it there.
Indeed, and I'll get that link in the chat box once we get going. But first, I will do the screen share, and please let me know if you would like to be a reader for us. Okay, Howard Marks, start us off, please.
Okay, could you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. And Yaakov lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children to Leah and to Rachel and to the 2 handmaids. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. And he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted up his eye. Okay, good.
Sorry about that. You go on. One more verse. I apologize.
Okay, and he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children and said, "Who are those with thee?" And he said, "The children which God has graciously given thy servant."
Okay, and actually, Howard, I'm going to ask you to keep going for just a couple more verses, if you wouldn't mind.
Then the handmaids came near, they and their children, and they bowed themselves. And Leah also with her children came near and bowed themselves. And after came Joseph near and Rachel, and they bowed themselves. And okay.
Great, we're going to pause there.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Howard. We're going to pause. We are going to pick back up. We're going to pause there. Thank you so much. So, okay, so we have a really interesting setup here. And earlier in our text, we didn't read this directly because of time, but earlier in our text, when Yaakov, well, I guess actually we do see it here. Yaakov divides his family ultimately into 2 camps. Why? Because when he finds out that there are these 400 men with Esav, he thinks to himself, well, if one part of my camp gets attacked, at least another part of it will survive. And what's really interesting here is that Yaakov has not seen Esav for 20 years. And if we remember what happened, what was the last thing, or what was the last thing that happened between Yaakov and Esav before Yaakov goes to Haran, right? Does anyone want to jump in and say, what was the last experience that they had before Yaakov went to Haran?
Maya?
Thank you. Well, he was running from his brother because after he stole his birthright, and their father passed away, it was like he thought, oh no, like he's going to come after me. So his mother sent him off to Laban.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Exactly. So Esav is furious with Yaakov because Yaakov has now stolen his bracha, stolen his blessing, stolen his birthright. Although, interestingly, in Parashat Toldot, when Esav gives Yaakov the birthright, it's pretty like, whatever, I don't need this thing. But when it comes to the bracha, it's a completely different situation. Yaakov disguises himself with Rivka really engineered it and then stole the bracha. So Esav is outraged, and Esav is threatening to kill Yaakov. And so what does Rivka do? Rivka says, well, you better get out of here, Yaakov, because your brother is threatening to kill you. So then, of course, last week's parsha, Yaakov goes to Haran and connects with, marries Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah, and lives with Lavan for these 20 years and serves Lavan. And there's a whole interchange by that at the end of the parsha last week. And now he's coming back. He has heard a divine call to return, and he is thinking, oh my God, there's my brother with 400 soldiers, 400 men. I've always understood that to be 400 troops, right? And he hates me. He's going to kill me. That's what he wanted to do these 20 years ago. So in his mind, right, in Yaakov's mind, he is being cornered. Think about the way in which we experience, just in this text alone, and we will continue with the text a little bit, but just in this piece of it, the fact that there is this orchestration of a bow, right? Where if we think back to the brachot from a couple of weeks ago, that we're told, again, as we are told often in Genesis, that Yaakov is going to receive the dew of the fat of the land and all of these beautiful blessings, and that, Esav will ultimately serve him. And in some ways, it was pointed out in a commentary that I was studying earlier today that Yaakov actually kind of flips that bracha on its head with the way in which he bows himself down, and he and his wives bow themselves down 7 times before their brother in this deep, it's hard to know, is this an honor? Is this an action of honor? Is this an action of fear? Another thing that I want to point out, and then I'm going to open it up for some conversation before we continue, is I think the order is really important here. And in next week's parasha, it will become even more illuminated for us. If we think about it, we look at our text, the order of the camp and the wives, he puts Bilhah and Zilpah first. So let's think about that for a second. I understand that, and I would love to hear from others. I have not read nearly as much commentary on this as I would like. So if folks have found good commentary that illuminates this point, but I have always understood that putting Bilhah and Zilpah in front is kind of Yaakov saying, well, these are my lesser wives and these are my lesser children. Then we have Leah and her children. And then we have Rachel and Yosef, because Binyamin will be born towards the end of this parsha. He is not yet born in the narrative arc. And I want us to pause there and think about the fact that every year at this time, we're going to spend the next few weeks yet still with our ancestor Yaakov. And Yaakov's a really challenging character. And I will also say, and I will also name, that the way that we read the Torah often is a reflection on our own inner lives. So I am someone who comes from a perspective, when I encounter this text, of deep gratitude to the Torah for giving us a picture of our ancestors that is fully human, and at the same time being very troubled by Yaakov and much of his behavior. And those two things I think are really important to lift up, because we are not being asked to imagine that Yaakov is a saint here. And we'll get to this as we go on. The rabbinic tradition has a very long history of assuming that Esau was the ultimate enemy, the arch enemy, the arch nemesis of the Jewish people. And I am experiencing in my own learning that there is a shift now where people are trying to start to read a little bit into Esau more from the Pshat perspective, so more from the direct textual perspective, and to try to ask ourselves the question, is Esau actually as terrible as we think he is, or we have been socialized to think he is, because he becomes associated with Edom, which is Rome, who ultimately destroyed our temple, and ultimately down the line with Christianity and the way in which being a Jew in Christian Europe was an absolutely terrible experience for most of our history. And so the rabbis, with their own worldview, really reflect that back onto the text, and therefore being able to speak about Esau in any particular way becomes much easier, because Esau is the epitome of all of the world's hatred for the Jewish people. So I think that there is a conversation to be had around what and who Esau is and what Esau represents, particularly because, and we'll continue in our text in a moment, when the brothers actually meet, they embrace and they kiss and they cry. So the fact that we have this rapidity of verbs in Hebrew indicates for us successive action, sequential action, that's very important. So I want us to actually pick back up, if we could, on verse 5. If we could pick back up on, actually, I think we'll go on verse 6. Anyone want to begin reading verse 6?
Let's see if we have a reader, and then, great, Bimaya. There we go, and now I will do the screen share. Just one moment. Alrighty, go ahead, Bimaya.
Okay. So on 6, I will need you to make it, there we go. The handmaidens came near, they and their children, and they bowed themselves. And Leah also with her children came near and bowed themselves. And after came Yosef near and Rahel, and they bowed themselves. And he said, What meanest thou by all this drove which I met? And he said, These are to find favor in the sight of my Lord. And Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what thou hast to thyself. And Yaakov said, By no means. If now I have found favor in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. For truly I have seen thy face, as though I had seen the face of an angel, and thou wast pleased with me. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And he urged him, and he took it. And he said, Let us take our journey, and let us go, and I will go before thee. He said to him, My Lord knows that the children are tender, and the flocks and herds giving suck are care for me. And if they should overdrive them one day, all the flock will die. Let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant, and I will lead on slowly, according to the pace of the cattle that goes before me, and the children, until I come to my Lord, to Seir. And Esau said, Let me now leave with thee some of the folk that are with me. And he said, What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to pause you there. What do you notice? Does anyone, and I should say we paused one verse too early. That's my fault, my mistake. Yaakov goes to Sukkot. And that's a very important thing because Yaakov does not actually follow Esau. He tells Esau that he's going to follow him, but he doesn't actually. Or he says, I'll come by later, I'll go by the pace of my children and my flocks. But as we see in the text, that actually doesn't happen. So before I kind of give over my own thoughts on this, I really want to hear from you either in the chat or verbally rather. What do you notice about this scene between the two brothers?
Lauren, would you like me to read from the chat what's coming in?
Yes, please, if you don't mind.
So Wendy says formal, overly polite. And Mitt says they are both wary of each other.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yes, thank you.
And a couple of hands. We have Lois. Go ahead.
I feel like that Yaakov is fearful of Esau, and he's going out of his way, to bow, have his family bow before Esau. I don't feel like Esau is wary of Yaakov. I feel like he feels very comfortable, and it seems like he's trying to put Yaakov at ease.
Thank you, Lois.
Nina?
This entire setup struck me as very performative and theatrical, as if the entire way that Yaakov is approaching Esau is almost entering a theater and setting out the players on the stage, and it doesn't strike me as having reconciliatory, if that's a word, content. It really just strikes me as very performative and theatrical. Sort of obligatory, this is what I should be doing, this is how it should look, the sort of the bowing, the scraping, the sort of obeisance. It seems to lack a sense of really familial love and kind of desire for reconciliation.
Yes, thank you for that. Anyone else have any thoughts?
There's a few more comments in the chat. Christina says the text reflects hesitation.
Mm-hmm.
And Ayala says he's once again deceiving his brother, so maybe it's a cold peace. Jeffrey says Jacob is trying to curry favor with Esau. He's careful not to arouse his wrath. Bimaya says so many pronouns used when they could have easily used names. Doreen, seems Jacob just can never be honest or transparent his whole life. So sad. Daniel, Yaakov is wary of Esau. And Anthony, I think Esau was going for a confrontation, but was overwhelmed with emotion when he saw Yaakov and his family. David, Jacob is choosing peace over violence. Christina, hesitation and cautious yet elated. They don't touch the subject of the birthright or blessing, and no apology, says Ivan. Should I pause there? There's still more comments, but I didn't know if you wanted to react to any of them.
Yeah, that'd be great. Let's pause there and then we'll keep going with the comments. And thank you, Julie, for reading those aloud as well. Yeah, so what's really striking to me and engaging with all of your great comments as well is that this is such an ambiguous text. And how we encounter it and how we experience it, I believe also is very emblematic of where we are in our own journey through life. So, as I encounter this text every year, I have a different perspective on it. This year, what's really coming to me is Yaakov's fear. And think about the ways in which when we don't know an outcome, when we don't have information, even and especially in our world now, which is like overwhelmed by information, we tend to create narratives. We tend to make assumptions, and we tend to get ourselves in spirals. That happened to me just this morning, right? We tend to find ourselves going into thought spirals and assuming that things are going to go a particular way, either because that's what happened historically. So in this case, if Yaakov is afraid of Esau, is that because when Yaakov really fled to Haran, it was because Esau was going to kill him. And therefore he's terrified. He's trying to make sure that his family is in a particular formation and all the honor and all of the kavod and everything, because he doesn't know what's going to happen. So when we assume, based on prior information, that the contemporary reality is going to fit a mold we've already assumed, we tend to overcorrect, as Yaakov is doing here, right? At the same time, as many of you have pointed out, this is a really difficult text in that Yaakov isn't entirely honest either. It does feel like a very formal, cold piece. The two brothers hug and they cry, so there is that emotion, but it's almost as though that emotion can't fully be expressed, right? Like it gets to a point, I don't know how many of us experience in our own lives, just something for us to think about. We're not going to share it in this space, but just for us to think about, how many of us experience a world in which we might experience a lot of emotional reaction and don't feel able to express that, don't feel like there's space for that. So if we take this text much more slowly, and here I am relying on something that I'm learning through my work in somatics right now. Somatics is a body-based way of kind of getting to understand how emotions and reactions and sensations impact how we react, how our nervous system reacts. It's a really interesting new frame. It's a framework that I am just learning about now. But if we apply it to here, right, we've got a situation where Yaakov has had this very active dream, we'll call it. He is literally injured because his hip is torn or his thigh is torn. He wakes up, his brother is coming at him with 400 men. He has his family in a very particular formation where the wives go with their children. We first have Yohan, Zilpah with their sons, and they bow down, and then Leah with her children, and then she bows down, and Rachel with Yosef. And then Yaakov bows, and then they near each other, and they embrace, and they cry, and they weep, and they kiss each other. And if we just stop to think about, like, I can't imagine how Esav is experiencing this. His brother, and he even says to his brother, right, like, why are you doing all of this? And what does Yaakov say? Well, because I'm trying to find favor in the eyes of my brother, right? Like, I'm terrified you're going to kill me, Esav. Like, what can I do to appease you so that you won't kill me? Is that a kind of a reconciliation that we're actually, like, do the brothers reconcile? Or rather, do they just have this very performative, perfunctory encounter and go their separate ways? Which they do go their separate ways at the end. Esav goes to Seir, Yaakov goes to Sukkot, and they don't have a real relationship after that as far as we are aware. Which is true, which is really a shame, because think about what that could have been like for the family. And think about in our own lives, how many of us have estrangements? How many of us have breakdowns with our own families? This is so deeply human. And also we can take from this that if we slow down, right, everything feels very, very quick, right? Yaakov has the dream. Yaakov wakes up. Yaakov makes sure the family is all in a particular formation. Then there's the sequence that we've gone over a few times now. Then there's this embrace. Then there's the negotiation. No, I don't need anything. I have enough. No, I have enough. No, I have enough. No, I have enough. No, I have enough. I don't need anything from you. I hope I have favor in your eyes, right? And I'm very deliberately speaking in a staccato way because I'm imagining these brothers have traveled. Think about the amount of time also, the physical time that it took them to actually travel to meet each other. I mean, of course, they didn't have the kinds of means of travel that we do today, right? And then this encounter is so rapid fire because they're terrified. And part of what we can learn from this is to ask ourselves, okay, what is driving me? We don't always get to where we want to go, but what is driving me and why am I being so reactive? Now, Yaakov has a very real fear of, like, well, my brother was going to kill me, and that's why I ran away, and I don't even know if my father's alive, and I don't have any contact with my family, and it's been 20 years. And that's not a small thing. And Esav is probably really wary as well because they left on such terrible terms. And who knows what kind of stereotypes are being fostered now between the brothers. So I'm going to pause there for more reactions and thoughts. Julie, you mentioned there were more comments in the chat.
Yes, and Lenore, did you, I saw that your hand was raised before. Did you want to make a comment or ask a question?
No, I made it. I put it in the chat.
Oh, okay, great. So here it is. Okay, so I'll read it out loud. Lenore says, this text is interpreted based on where each of us is coming from, our background and training. This is the first time you see some aspect of brotherly love and caring. Many fail to appreciate that it was Esav that was deceived and denied the brotherly love from Yaakov. We should close our eyes and put ourselves in Esav's shoes. Who is trying to appease who has done the wrong? And there was some back and forth about Esav and the plain meaning of the text, the pshat, being very different from the Jewish interpretation of the character of Esav.
Yes, and I actually want to pause there for a second and address that directly. So thank you, Lenore, for that, and thank you for the back and forth, because this is exactly why this is why I very intentionally for our learning together today only am giving you the pshat, because I think it is very important for us to actually put ourselves into Esav's position. Esav becomes, as we said, understood in rabbinic tradition and like this is another piece I think is really important, right? Like for very understandable reasons. Esav became the ultimate oppressor of the Jewish people. And we all read texts based on where we physically are located and where we are socially located. That's what I believe. And what do I mean by those things? Exactly what you were saying, Lenore, that we are coming each of us to Torah from our own perspective. And all of those perspectives are really important to understand this text. That's the idea of the 70 faces, the Shiv'im Panim LaTorah, the 70 interpretations of Torah, the infinite interpretations of Torah. But if we pause and put ourselves, we have, of course, this really is from Yaakov's perspective, right? If we put ourselves into Esav's perspective, he has been deceived. He will be deceived again. He says to Yaakov, come with me. I want you to come with me. We'll find a way to live together. But Yaakov doesn't take him up on that. Yaakov goes a different way. But it seems very clear that Esav genuinely wants Yaakov to come with him. But how often is it that we get caught in our own fear spirals and we don't actually take people at their word in a positive way? You know, Maya Angelou, I believe it was, who said, when somebody tells you who they are, believe them, right? And that's so true in all kinds of human encounters, but that's as true of positive as it is the negative. And we tend to be very hardwired for the negative. But if Esav here in the Pshat is saying to Yaakov, come with me, and then Yaakov doesn't, well, that's yet another stab in the back, right? So this does not mean that Yaakov is a terrible person. It means that Yaakov and Esav and all of us are complex people. And we each have an inner Yaakov and we each have an inner Esav. We have those impulses. And if we stop and put ourselves into Esav's perspective and say, my brother is coming to meet me. I haven't seen him in 20 years. He stole this bracha from me. I had one of the worst moments of my life right before he left. And he didn't even leave. He fled to Haran because he was terrified I was going to come after him. How am I supposed to relate to this man? This man who is my twin. This man who is closer to me than anyone else, you know? So I'm going to pause there for any other comments or questions.
Great. So we'll start with Betsy, followed by Tanya.
I think it's pretty clear that they didn't have much in common and didn't really grow up very close. I think it's enough that they reconciled.
Mm-hmm.
They no longer had that fear and that hatred in their heart.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Absolutely.
Okay, okay, sometimes I think Esau is over vilified. And for me, when I read this text this year, he was an example of forgiveness because, you know, sometimes we get older, we become wiser, and things change. And we realize sometimes it's time to put it to rest. And yeah, it was probably very hurtful that Rivka chose Yaakov over him. And that his parents probably had some issues with the way his mother parented him, but he's an older man, he's probably middle age, and it's just time to put away old wounds and grudges.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Tanya. Absolutely. Do we have any other comments?
Yes, we have a few more. We actually have 3 more hands.
Great. Let's take all 3.
Okay, great. So Mark, we'll start with you.
Okay, Jacob doesn't trust Esau because Jacob isn't trustworthy. He's been a deceiver, you know, most of his life. He learned it from his mother. And so here we're in a situation that here he's the progenitor of the Jewish people, and he's such a dishonest guy. It really kind of rankles me that we didn't have a better moral character to the father of our Jewish people than a deceiver and a liar.
Yeah, I really hear you, Mark. Thank you for sharing that. All right, who else do we have?
Okay, Carlisle and then Susan Doug, and we'll swing back to you, Nina, if there's time, since you had an opportunity to speak already. We'll start with Carlisle.
Carol. It's Carol. Okay.
Sorry.
Well, Esav is a victim. He was a victim of his mother and brothers scheming together, and then his father's complicity in deceiving him. But Yaakov is also a victim because this is how he was raised. I mean, his mother was the one who set the example for him. So This is what he's learned. He's learned to survive throughout his life through deception. And he learned that also from his uncle, deception. So it's not surprising that he then goes into this meeting with his brother with such fear. And he really can never give that up. There's this underlying guilt that motivates him. So we have a victimized twin on one hand, and the other twin who is carrying this burden of guilt throughout his life.
Thank you, Carol. And I think we have time for a couple more.
Go ahead, Susan and Doug.
Might take a slightly contrary view of this and say that I'm not sure there was really a reconciliation here. And I don't think Jacob necessarily trusted Esau. You have to remember that Esau came over there with 400 men, and they may have had a nice conversation with each other, but in the end, Jacob goes the other way because he's still leery about Esau, that Esau might be leading them off into a prison in Esau's camp, basically. And I just don't think that we know for sure. Well, based on Jacob's going the other way, I don't know that there really was a reconciliation. I think he was still afraid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cindy.
Hi, thank you so much. So I'd like to know what this portends for the future. Like, if there's this foundational rift, how do we work on that today to kind of heal these wounds and bring about tikkun olam? That's my question, based upon, the Parsha and all the commentary that we've been hearing. Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, Cindy, that's a really good segue into kind of how I wanted to bring us to a close. Do we have any other comments? I don't want to miss anyone.
We do have, so Nina for a second comment, and we have Bob Goodstein.
Okay, let's take them both. Let's start with Bob, and then we'll do Nina, and then I will close. Great.
Okay, one quick thing. You have two brothers that are at opposite ends. And yes, there may be a reconciliation, but the brothers decide to go their separate ways. And yes, they're not trusting of each other, but they kind of make up and they kind of say, okay, you're fine, I'm fine, let's go our separate ways. And, in real life, it works that way too. There are many times that brothers part company and say, yes, we love each other, but no, we can't coexist.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Nina.
So I was thinking a lot about what you said, Rabbi, about taking people at face value, sort of listening to what people say and believing it. And I think it's tragically often the case that even if you tell somebody what you mean and why you mean it, and you offer forgiveness and you offer acceptance, they answer with suspicion or silence. And I think that's as true in the Bible as it is anywhere else. And it's the sort of lingering tragedy of kind of talking past one another and not being able to see and hear one another in sort of the Peshat of our lives, if that's a phrase. And I think that tragedy keeps cycling its way through the human community with devastating consequences. And I'm not sure why we seem so wired to be cynical about offerings that are meant in a genuine good spirit.
Yeah. Thank you. That is such a beautiful way to end. And I want to kind of tie a bunch of things together. One of the things that I love so much about learning with all of you is that we get to hear so many different perspectives. But to this question that has come up in a couple of ways, Cindy, you also raised it, is what I wanted to close on, which is later on in our Parsha, we have the very famous scene of Yaakov getting a name change to Yisrael. And Mark had mentioned like how hard it is to have Yaakov being our forefather, right? Yaakov is the progenitor of our people, Yaakov and Yitzchak and Abraham and all of our imahot and avot. So what does it mean to then have this in our ancestral line? And the truth, I think for me, and I struggle with this all the time myself, right? What does this mean? But I think the truth is, as we know, that we are very complex people. And as has been pointed out a couple of times now, we tend to be very suspicious of one another, and often for really good reason, right? I am certainly just as susceptible, just as prone to that as anyone else, as any of you, as any of us. And part of, I think, what we can do, and part of what these episodes in our Torah can help us work through is, how do we work on our own reactivity? I don't know that we're necessarily I don't think that the goal is to try to eliminate the fact that as human beings, we tend to be very cynical. I don't think we can just like pretend that that doesn't exist. I think that we get to work with it though. And I think we get to ask ourselves, when this is arising, what do I do with it? I mean, for example, as was pointed out by one of you, like that Esav is coming with 400 men. I mean, what do you think except that 400 men is an army? So Yaakov's like, he's going to kill me. And if we think about how rabbinic interpretation has taken it, I mean, it makes so much sense that Esav is vilified. So today, in an incredibly difficult time in which we all live, when it feels like trying to have any kind of tikkun is nearly impossible, maybe we can, as part of our own learning and growth, figure out in our own lives, starting from the very micro, right? How many of us in our own lives have rifts with family members or rifts with people we used to hold in high esteem or still really care about but just cannot reconcile with? Maybe these stories can kind of give us a little bit to work with around our own practice of honoring our choices, because I trust that we make choices based on what we know and based on the best circumstances that are available, but also asking ourselves, could things go differently? What is this person's motivations? Might I consider opening a dialogue again? And only you can know the answer to that. But I think that with Yaakov and Esav, one of the things we learned is that going one separate way is sometimes the best choice. And that we all have that inner Yaakov, we all have that inner Esav. And when Yaakov gets his name changed to Yisrael, which is the name that we are known by, Yisrael, one who struggles with God. Yisrael, one who is upright, right with God. Yaakov is still called Yaakov. Most of the time when you get a name change, I'm thinking of Abraham and Sarah. They are no longer known as Avram and Sarai. They are known as Abraham and Sarah. But Yaakov is still called Yaakov. So we know that he is still working on becoming Yisrael. And may we work with our own inner experience of that this week and going forward. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for having me.